The frames that we're exposed to have this power, have this ability to kind of foreground or advance certain ways of seeing the world while simultaneously backgrounding others. Like if I ask you to think about the value of interdependence, your cultural mindset of collectivism kind of gets pulled forward and your more individualistic tendencies may get pushed to the background. It also accumulates and happens over time. So framing also has this role to play in the process of culture change. Can we persistently and consistently position information and ideas in ways that pull forward and give people practice activating different mindsets, which over time changes the relative dominance of those mindsets in a given culture.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Scientists, philanthropies, governments, and NGOs alike often find themselves in possession of an important truth that could improve the world, but the public just can't seem to hear it. As the CEO of the Frameworks Institute in Washington, D.C., Nathaniel Kendall-Taylor and his colleagues are experts in reframing messages so that they can be heard, and develops mobilization strategies to get messages into the world. Nat is an expert in psychological anthropology and communication science. In addition to his role as the CEO of the Frameworks Institute, he is also a senior fellow at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, a visiting professor at the Child Study Center at Yale School of Medicine, and a fellow at the British American Project. In this episode, Nat and I talk about what frames really are and how they impact thinking and cultural mindsets, as well as the steps needed to change that mindset. We also discuss how the Frameworks Institute helps nonprofits disseminate information to enact social change, the keys to conveying information effectively, the importance of having a strong mobilization strategy when introducing a new idea, and we go pretty deep on the steps we might take to reframe work as a product that employees buy, as well as other topics. If you enjoy this episode, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. And now, my conversation with Nathaniel Kendall-Taylor. Nathaniel Kendall-Taylor, welcome to Work for Humans.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to talking with you.
So you're the Chief Executive Officer of the Frameworks Institute. What's the mission of that institute?
Ironically, Frameworks is a communications organization, and it's really hard to communicate in a short sentence about what it is that we do. There's a couple of important features. One is that we're a nonprofit organization, and that allows us to kind of work exclusively on communicating about social issues. Second is that we are a research organization. We're a group of primarily social scientists who study different aspects of the really complicated process of how people understand information and how our communications can kind of lead to different understandings. And our mission is to support individuals and organizations working towards progressive change with the kind of research that we do, to kind of look into cultural mindsets, to look into framing, and to add some value to equip people who are out in the world trying to make change to be able to use our work as one of many tools that they need to use in that work of, sounds a little dramatic, but kind of trying to change the world and make it a better place.
When you say frames and frameworks, the way I understand that is that underlying how we think about things is the way we frame the problem space. What does a frame describe exactly? And how do we use them to think? And maybe what's an example of that?
I think this is something kind of unique about the work that I've done and that we've done at Frameworks over the last, I've been here for 15 years. The organization has been around for nearly 25, is that we've kind of pulled apart your sentence in what I think is a useful and helpful way. And we really are interested in two concepts and how they relate. So we are interested in frames and framing, and we kind of define framing as the choices that we make in how we present ideas. And those can be pretty obvious choices that we make. Sorry, I know you're interested in metaphor. The metaphors that we choose to explain how things work, or the values that we advance to argue for why an issue matters and its resolution is so important. But it's also small and seemingly insignificant choices that we make. It's whether we talk about they, them, those people over there, or we talk about we and our. It's in verbs and how certain verbs imply agency, power, and action, and others deny it. So framing is all those choices, big and small, and how they affect how people think, how people understand our information, how people feel, importantly, kind of how people connect emotionally to the ideas that we're trying to advance, and then what people do, how people act and behave as a result of information being presented. So one idea is frames, and we kind of think of frames as these cues, these choices that are in the discourse, right? They're in the way that we talk, they're in the information that we hear, they're in the images that we see. And the second concept is the idea what psychological anthropologists call cultural models, what in our field have been called cultural mindsets. And those cultural mindsets are these deep implicit patterns of thinking that we use to understand information. And so cultural mindsets are the things that are kind of on the inside, right? That we carry them around with us and we use them without knowing it to process information. And so the interesting thing, and the thing that I think is really helpful both in how you study communications, but also in how we try to help support people's communications practice, is that it's the frame that are kind of swirling around us in our discourse and the information that we're presented with that activate the cultural mindsets that we hold in mind, that then shape how we think, feel, and act. So it's really these cultural mindsets that are the mediating force between the frames that we're exposed to and the results that those frames have in our understanding and our feeling and our action. I think it's been really important in the work that we do, that we have done, and in the field more generally, to kind of try to pull apart frames so that frames aren't just everywhere and anywhere and everywhere. They're not in here and out there, but frames are really kind of located in an external space. And they have this power to kind of cue, or as my mentor, psychological anthropologist named Brad Shore, who is kind of one of the founders of cultural models theory, talks about kind of foregrounding or backgrounding cultural mindsets. So the frames that we're exposed to have this power, have this ability to kind of foreground or advance certain ways of seeing the world while simultaneously backgrounding others. And so the process of framing is really about this selective activation, this foregrounding and backgrounding of ways of seeing the world. And the really interesting thing, like the thing that kind of starts to blow my mind, is that happens in the moment all the time. Like if I ask you to think about the value of interdependence, your cultural mindset of collectivism kind of gets pulled forward and your more individualistic tendencies may get pushed to the background. But it also accumulates and happens over time, right? So the more and more certain mindsets are activated, the more and more they become top of mind, dominant, easy to think with, so to speak. So framing has this effect both in the moment, which is how most framing studies are done. Experimentally, we expose people to ideas and we see the effect that they have. But framing also has this really important role to play in the process of culture change, right? Can we persistently and consistently position information and ideas in ways that pull forward and give people practice, exercise in activating different mindsets, which over time changes the relative dominance of those mindsets in a given culture.
That's super interesting. And I'll tell you why this is so important to people who listen to this show. First of all, this is a show that is very much about leading a change, and it's very much about looking at, especially changing how we think about work. And anybody who has ever led a big change that involves a lot of people has had the experience of throwing the right idea into the mix and having it simply bounce off. And it's bewildering when it happens, right? You're like, this is such an obviously good idea, and yet it can't fit into the frame that people are already holding. And so, are there examples of this from history where there's been a change and a replacement of one frame with another? And I know, I'm going to say up front, I know it never happens 100%. It's just a proportion of the population that's going to take on a new frame and it changes the discourse. But there's always some proportion of the population that holds a different frame.
Yeah, and it also never happens completely for one person, right? That's why the foregrounding, backgrounding heuristic is interesting to me. It's not a switch, right? It's not like all of a sudden your ability to think with one mindset is completely turned on and the other one is turned off. It's both uneven across populations, but it's also gradual and a continuum within the same person, if that makes sense. The experience that you talked about, where people who are listening have been in these situations where, they think they have the perfect way of talking about patterns of employment or the economy or whatever it may be. And they go out and they try to use that way of talking with people who are outside of their immediate circle. And it's rarely as good as they think it's going to be. Either just it doesn't have a lot of grip or traction, or creates these kind of what are called backfire effects, or what we think about as you say, they think scenarios, where you think you have the perfect way. We do a lot of work on early childhood development. You think you have the perfect way of talking about the detrimental effects of stress and adversity. And you try it out with colleagues who work on the detrimental effects of stress and adversity, and it's great. And then you go out and you communicate with normal people and find out that it isn't so great, and frequently sends people in the exact opposite direction. And so this is why we have an organization. This is how all of our projects come to us, where people who have been working on an issue more technically find themselves in positions where they really struggle to communicate it effectively, and frequently find themselves in these lost in translation kind of loops. And our job is to help figure out why there is that lost in translation moment, and then equip people with better ways of positioning the information such that the intention of the communication more consistently aligns with its actual effect. This has happened. Your question about history, there are a number of examples where careful, strategic, and above all else, persistent attempts to shift thinking have succeeded based on framing. The one that I like the best, because it's kind of nice and neat and kind of I can do it in a short time period, not neat necessarily in the kind of cool, neat way, but is tobacco and tobacco advocacy. So for a very long time, tobacco advocates, people working to address health issues arising from use of tobacco, framed the issue as one of individual vice. So people needed to stop smoking. People needed more information about how smoking was bad. They needed more education, and they would stop smoking. And so that way of communicating, that way of positioning the issue, activates a certain mindset, the very dominant mindset in American culture of individualism, that outcomes are the way that they are as a result of the decisions that people make. And once that mindset is activated, there's a set of actions that make a whole lot of sense, right? So better individual choices and education makes a whole lot of sense. And then there's a set of things that don't make a whole lot of sense. So if it's an issue of individual vice, why in the world would we regulate corporations and do things at the industry level? And so, like you said, this didn't happen overnight. It was a kind of a slow and gradual process, but a frame shift. So the advocates went from that positioning of individual vice to a very intentional frame around corporate wrongdoing, right? They really switched from better decisions to kind of the supply side of the discussion. And once that shift in framing changed, they started to activate a very different mindset. So kind of a mindset about how what surrounds us shapes us, around corporate malfeasance, around how the system is rigged. And once that became the operative, the dominant mindset that people were using to think, all of a sudden, a very different set of action starts to make sense. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that you'd be advocating for better individual decisions, but it does make a whole lot of sense that, wow, we should be regulating this product. We should be doing things at that industry level, because that is really where the problem lies. And so I think that's just a fantastic example of a frame shift that activates a shift in mindsets that then leads to a different set of solutions making sense and garnering a whole lot more support.
Yeah, I like that. I like in particular that different problems require different tools. And it just brings to hand different measurements of success. Different tools come to hand, more powerful tools. One of the examples from your work, I know you've done a lot of work with child health, mental health, adolescent health. Let's do two things at the same time. Let's talk about how that kind of work comes to you, what steps you go through to understand the existing frames and so on, and then what the outcome looks like. And we'll refer back to adolescent health.
The answer to the first question I've kind of started to talk to a little bit, which is we have people come to us when they have been in the middle of these really dire communications challenges, where there's, in this case, where there's a group of scientists, of researchers, of advocates and practitioners who feel like they have really important information to communicate about adolescent development, about youth mental health, and they just are unable to cut through and advance those ideas. They're unable to kind of open space for people to consider ideas and information in new ways. And it's unfortunate that the only people who come to us are those with problems, but I guess we're kind of slightly in the business of problem solving, which I really like. And we have a process that we've developed over the last 25 years that we use to add value and support those people who are trying to do good work, but are having trouble moving their ideas into the broader discussion. And so the first step is to really, and you'd be amazed at how much communications research and practice completely skips this first step, which is you first have to figure out what it is you want to say, right? So you have to go to those people who are in that position of having that communications difficulty and really work with them to figure out what the core ideas are that they want to be able to get through. Kind of like, what is the story you want to tell? Amazing how difficult, this is not meant critically, but how difficult it is to come to a concise set of core ideas that you want to be able to advance and that you believe really strongly that if more people understood those ideas, the world would be different and better in some way. So that's the first step. The second step is then to move to the question of what are the stories that are being told, right? So what are the media stories about young people and adolescents? And then what are the stories that people are telling themselves? What are those deep cultural mindsets that people use without knowing it to make sense of young people? You know, why is it that whenever I say the word adolescent or teens, I mean, I have a very predictable, you almost did it, you didn't quite do it, but the very predictable response is this kind of eye roll, this kind of assumption that, oh, what a tough time. Like if we can only make it through without being totally ruined, that's a good thing. That reaction is premised on a cultural mindset. It's premised on a set of assumptions that we have about young people and this period of life.
I know. I repeat that story all the time. I say, how old are your kids? They're 10. I'm like, oh, just wait. Wait till they're 13. You're going to have the real experience. And that's exactly the kind of repetitive framing that gets into everybody's brain.
And that's so, I mean, what you just said there is so interesting. I want to pause on this. This is sometimes the fancy academic term for that is the double birth of meaning, right? So we have these mindsets which lead us to react in this way, which then reinforce those mindsets, right? So it's this really pernicious cycle between the way that we think and the way that we see and hear ideas being presented that frequently creates this cycle whereby we are led to think even more and more strongly and deeply in those ways. So, I mean, why do we think about the economy as a force of nature? Well, part of the reason is because we're reminded constantly by the metaphors that economists use, by the way that these issues are covered in the media, by the conversations that you and I have, that it is a force of nature, which then kind of just is a self-perpetuating cycle that further strengthens and ingrains that way of thinking. But that's the next step. So we start to think from an understanding of the ideas that people want to communicate, the stories that they're trying to tell, the stories that are being told, the way that people currently think, and the issue is currently being framed. What are a set of alternatives that at least seem viable, right? What are a set of hypotheses? We think that instead of always leading conversations with about adolescent development with stories about the difficulty of the process, we think that leading with a set of examples about young people making positive contributions to communities might be a really different way of getting into those conversations. This is, I think, the coolest, and to me as a not a creative person, the most difficult part of our process. We try to generate as many of those ideas as we can, right? So what if instead of letting people assume that the economy is a force of nature, we intentionally talk about it as a designed system, right? We use metaphors of computer design or other sources that we already clearly see as being designed based on a set of choices. And then we don't just stop there, because we frequently have the majority of our ideas are horrible. We then test them. We go out and we expose people to these new ways of thinking qualitatively and quantitatively in experiments, and we measure and observe the effects that positioning issues in different ways have on the way that people think, feel, and act. And then the final part of the process, which is to me the hardest part, is that once you have a set of frames that there's some evidence behind suggesting that they lead to kind of different ways of thinking and feeling and acting, how do you get those frames out into the world in powerful, persuasive, authentic, and most of all, persistent over time ways? And it's that kind of implementation part of the process that I find both really kind of overwhelming. Like, how do you think about changing the surround sound that people are exposed to, but also incredibly exciting? And that's the part of our work, ironically, as a researcher, that I'm kind of most interested in these days.
Let me just read through one of your core narrative examples from adolescence, from your work with adolescents. And I want to call out a couple of things in it. We might be able to talk about them. Here's the core narrative example. Adolescence is a time of remarkable opportunity and growth. From around age 10 to about 25, so the important thing is defining what adolescence is. Like, I wouldn't have thought that it ended at 25. I would have thought that it ended at 18. From about 10 to 25, we discover, and what's important here is this metaphor of how adolescents learn and benefit from exploration. So we discover, learn from, and adapt to the world around us. We forge our sense of who we are and who we aspire to be. We learn to make decisions, manage our emotions, and create deeper connections with peers and others in our communities. So a very big focus here on connection and community, the opposite of isolation. We also build resilience and develop interests, passions, and meaningful goals that shape our adult lives. Our developing brains are well suited to these tasks. Okay, this is really interesting. It wasn't called out in what you wrote, but this idea that our developing brains are a superpower, not a hazard in our world. Because that's sort of the idea. Well, people's brains break for this period of time and then they get good again. But the idea that this is a superpower to be able to take on these tasks, but too often the systems that serve us are not. Adults working to support young people must transform dysfunctional and discriminatory systems to ensure that all of us have the support we need to explore, discover, and become a force for good in our communities and society during adolescence and as we transition into adulthood. The important thing being there is that this is a time of learning for the future of an adult. It's not about making just the adolescence thing, but that it's for the purpose of creating whole, connected, capable, agentic adults. So it's a beautiful phrase. This whole thing is just beautifully written, and you can just feel it. I can feel it change how I'm thinking.
Yeah, and then it becomes less beautiful when you realize that each and every one of those choices is the product of a ton of research that goes into exploring, like, what happens if you talk about the benefits of supporting young people as being only in the present, only in the future, or both now and later. So that's kind of like one of the experimental manipulations that we've conducted on this project and other projects, and of this kind of interesting finding that it's so much more effective when you talk about, and we kind of talk about it as the now and later recommendation, about talking about the benefits that accrue in the present from doing better in supporting young people or early childhood, young children. But also that there's this, as you were saying, this kind of future down the line set of impacts of collective benefits that accrue when we make these decisions about how to use our resources. So each one of those things that you read is a very careful articulation of a research process designed to test different ways of positioning issues. So, I mean, that metaphor piece that you talked about, the metaphor of discovery and exploration, is the result of, and don't ask me to name all of these things, probably testing more than 25 different metaphors that can be used to kind of in a more balanced way, position the process of development and avoid the tendency that people have that we just talked about of viewing this as like a risky, inevitably dangerous process where we just try to protect our kids by limiting their exposure to the very experiences that they need to experience positive development.
When you say that you're particularly interested in this last part of the process right now, are you interested in it as a research topic, or are you interested in it as a process that, as hard as it is, you enjoy?
I mean, I think it's both. I think there's a third piece, which is the theory of it, like our collective understanding of how to do this well, I think is not as robust as other parts of the framing endeavor. So I kind of think about all successful framing work. I mean, the tobacco example being one, has to have two things. It has to have a framing strategy, which is what you just went through on adolescent development. It has to have a set of strategies that we use to position our ideas in a consistent way, right? But it also has to have a mobilization strategy. There has to be a way that we are constructing a process that we're going to get these new ways of positioning the issue out to as many people as possible, or certain people, as many of certain people as possible over time to make change. And I just think that and it probably comes from the fact that I've done the first one of those for 15 years. And I know a lot of other people who have, but I think the thinking on the mobilization side of things and there's tons of people who are doing this work now, but it just feels younger as an area of theory that's developing. And to be completely frank, I've done way too many projects that have only done that first piece. And those projects just sit on the shelf or on someone's desk, having made no change in the world, which is absolutely not why we do the work.
I'll tell you, I suspect this is one of the challenges, which is that the first part of the process fits into a research mindset. And the second part of the process fits into an engineering mindset. And the engineering mindset is not as respected in academia. I've seen it in education departments where education departments focus on studying how people learn, but not on how people teach. And the teaching part of it is less prestigious than the learning part of it.
Yeah, I mean, the people who I think are currently really smart about that mobilization piece I'm not sure if they would call themselves engineers or design thinkers, but they're people who are kind of used to, and maybe that's the same thing, and I just don't know it.
Well, I mean, the difference is that the goodness of an idea in the research part is that it's true. The goodness of an idea in the execution part is that it works.
Yep.
And that is where design really lives. And I do think of that as an engineering mindset.
Yeah. I mean, and I guess that's a great way of putting it. I guess for this work to work, it has to be true and work.
And work. And be effective.
So untrue and work gets you to the outcomes you don't want. True and not working gets you to no outcomes, right?
You can be very proud about what you developed and the truth of it.
Yeah. And I just to kind of get back to your question of kind of why I'm interested in that second piece. I mean, what you just went through is a really, and I mean this in a productive way, it's what we would call a narrative, not a story. It's a really high level kind of vague outline that could yield a million different stories, right? And so I think that the process of applying framing work for change is really one that figures out how to advance that common narrative over a bunch of different organizations and institutions that are telling stories in different ways, but where all of those stories kind of roll back up into that bigger narrative that is advanced, right? I think that's how culture changes, right? Culture does not change from a million organizations advancing a million different narratives. It comes from kind of a concerted dose of different reminders and ways of positioning issues and invitations to think.
So I want to get into the topic of this podcast. And the good news about the topic of this podcast, because it's about work and it's about rethinking work, a lot of the environments in which this needs to roll out is inside companies. A much smaller population that needs to be influenced. It's still sometimes too big a population, but it's smaller. And we've spoken about this a little bit, but I'm going to frame out some of the ideas that are behind this, which is, and by the way, earlier you told me that it's not good to start off by saying what the current frame is because all you do is load people with the current frame and then they can't think about anything else. I'm still going to do that.
Do it.
But I may not do this out of this room anymore, but I'm still going to do it because it is a lot like your process, which is the way things currently are thought about is that employees are framed as bought things. inside companies, and they are inputs to production. You can hear this in how people talk. So, for instance, people are referred to as assets or resources, or even the word employee means one who is used and who are acquired, which is about ownership. So all of these, the framing is around, I need to get some butts in seats, nice little fragmentary reference to people just by a part of them. So anyway, and this has made it so that employees are the thing that everybody's trying to work on, which is we got to fix employees. We need to make employees productive. And this has led to a very fixed set of tools. The reframe is, and by the way, I've seen probably 20 employee experience teams spun up and dismantled. And the reason is people can see that employee experience is important. They spin up a team, but the truth is this team doesn't get resourced because it's not fitting into the frame. And then it goes away. And so the alternative framing is that employees are customers. That means that work is a product. And instead of focusing on employees as the thing to fix, you focus on work as the thing to fix. And the tools are tools of design. The tools of the former framing is tools from psychology because you're complicated, I need to fix you. But this is tools of design, and it leads to new solution sets. So that's the path we're going down.
I mean, it's a really deep and very kind of metaphorical frame shift. The thing that I love about that is you can see really clearly how when you shift that frame, it leads to a different set of ways of thinking, and it leads to a different set of actions that kind of feel like common sense and others that feel like nonsense, right? So if employees are inputs, then there's a whole lot of things that seem natural, right? They're interchangeable. They aren't real people. They're just resources we use and kind of exhaust, and then find new ones and use and exhaust. And there's a set of practices and behaviors and policies that make sense if that's your organizing, what people call conceptual metaphors that you're using to think. And I think that, I mean, my anecdotal observation is I think that's the dominant metaphor that we use to think about work and labor in this country. That's without studying it, although we do have a project right now that I'll be able to sub out that anecdote for some actual data on reframing work and labor. And that I think the idea of, like, when you said it, employees as consumers feels like, that's crazy. I'm not used to thinking like that. But as soon as you do, it does the same thing. It puts a different, kind of activates a different set of mindsets, different ways of thinking about work and employers and employees that corresponds to a different set of things that make sense and things that don't make sense. I think you are correct to call what you're doing framing or reframing there. I would say that it's at a really deep kind of almost paradigm level that you're talking, which makes it really challenging, right? It makes it really challenging because of the way, the depth that employees as inputs is embedded into our current culture, the number of reminders that we get. And the only way of unseating that is to kind of change the signal, right? To consistently over time give people an alternative way of thinking about that very fundamental relationship.
So there's a words problem in here. And the problem is that there are no words to replace the words used by the existing paradigm. An example of this is, well, employee, since it means one who is used. There's no alternative word. And so there's kind of two possibilities here. Well, there is actually one, which is worker. That's not bad. But one of the questions is, do you strive to change the meaning of the words in people's heads, or do you come up with new words? And I think we've seen this with pronouns, which is, do you change the meaning of the words of the pronouns, or do you introduce new words that need to replace the old ones? Now, interestingly, it seems like changing the meaning of the words is probably the impossible way to do it.
I think, I mean, in an ideal, like most hard questions, the answer is, in an ideal world, both. Like, you'd want to try to crack the meaning that people attach to those words and create some space for either new meanings or new words to come in. I mean, the problem is even more pernicious than you're making it out. It's not only that those meanings are locked up, it's that those words are locked up with the issue. Employee is such a part of the way that we talk about work and labor that it's not only that employee has the meanings that it does, but it's that fundamental connections to the issue that we're talking about, right? So that just makes it even harder. Without a doubt, words matter, and they carry an incredible amount of meaning. But I also think that there's other things that matter. So, the ideas that you're trying to convey under those words are really significant. And I question any communicate, which is not what you're suggesting, but question any strategies for reframing that are completely reliant on kind of word replacement strategies. Let's say this instead of that. I think that framing is really about a set of ideas and a way of positioning issues that necessitate a lot of wording changes. So what you're talking about there, I don't think what you're talking about is really a wording change. I think you're talking about an idea change, right? You are talking about a fundamentally different constellation of choices that you make in how you talk about the people who do work.
Yeah. So the way I learned about your work was through John Kanya. And he has an inverted pyramid, which I want to describe, which is at the top, there are structural things that need to change. And those things tend to be explicit. We know what they are. And at the bottom of this stack, there's transformative change, and it tends to be implicit. And that's where the frames live, which is down there in the mental models. The way that we are starting to advance this is by trying to tackle all of those things. One of them is leaders of companies, C-suite and boards need to understand the reframe. And in a smaller company, that's possible. Bigger companies, it gets harder and harder. But then there's a bunch of practice of structural change that needs to happen. And a lot of that happens in two places. One is with line managers and giving them the tools to not just think this way, but actually act in this way. And honestly, another one is employees, because the truth is we've all seen ourselves as product for a long time. We go to school with the idea that we are making ourselves into a better product that can be consumed by companies. So almost every actor in this model needs to do two things. They need to think differently, but then they need to be equipped. I mean, you and I spoke beforehand, and you were talking about how you studied as a cultural anthropologist, and your family was like, that sounds like unemployment. and then you end up employed. But the fact that that conversation was happening there was exactly that conversation.
Yeah, and I mean, without knowing it, you've just kind of done a better explanation of the double birth of meaning that I just did than I did a minute ago, right? So it's the meaning, the ideas, the way that we make sense of information is both how we think about them and the experiences that we have in the structures and systems that we live in, right? So it's not just the experiences we have, it's not just in the way that we think, but it's that interaction between the two. And so for the people listening, I mean, what I would say that hopefully brings some of these big ideas down to a point where they're useful is the ideal situation, if you really want to change the outcomes that are the result of these ways of thinking and acting, is that you have to do both. You have to change mindsets. You have to change the way that people think and give some probably, alternative ways of conceptualizing what a worker is and does and how they fit into the system. But also you need to change kind of the everyday lived reality, the realities that people are in that give them different experiences that change those mindsets as well. I don't know if that was as concrete as I wanted it to be, but it's this constant discussion in our field of, whether you're better changing behavior or whether you're better changing mindsets. And I think that's just it's a false dichotomy. The answer is both, which I realize is not always possible given limited resources. And the question is actually like, which one do I do first, or which is more effective? But I think it's really important to kind of pull those two together. And I think if you can see the power of doing both, it starts to suggest things that you would do to start to change outcomes.
There's another both problem. Let's take adolescence as an example. Adolescence is a time of huge opportunity. It's also a time of risk. And you want to introduce the new frame into the world to balance it, to balance the conversation. But you can't introduce it in a balanced way, probably. You have to introduce the new frame in its purest form so that that frame can ultimately take foreground. I guess this is the foreground-background thing. The background thing isn't gone. The background thing is still something to think about. It's just not the foreground anymore. So I guess that's the answer to this both problem.
It is. I love the way that you've set that up. the outcome that we're trying to get to in the adolescent work is not that people in a Pollyannish way think that adolescence is this unfettered time of wonderful rainbows, unicorns, lollipops, and all other wonderful things. The goal is that people see it in a balanced way, which is what the science says. Science says it is an open period of learning. And with an open period of learning come risks and dangers, but also tremendous opportunity. The problem, as you said it, is the current situation is way out of balance, right? It's way tipped in the risk and danger perspective. The way that we counterbalance is we have to kind of dial up the opportunity and learning side of that to put that into the discourse to achieve better balance. But I should also say that when you totally leave out the current understanding and how you're communicating, right? So if you were to communicate with people about adolescence as this wonderful time without referencing, with no reference to the risk or danger, like that is the best formula for people to reject your message, think that you're full of it, and tune out. So there has to always be some reference to the current understanding, or else it's conspicuously absent.
Yeah. I had somebody come up to me after a conference and she was crying because I just told her that her whole career was using people as things. Basically, what I said is, the old model isn't gone. In other words, you still have to find great people for your organizations, and you need to do all the things. You need to know what their skills are. You need to help them to be successful. You need to do all those things. It's just the balance that's off. And actually, one of the most fundamental things that changes in this, I think this will be interesting to you, is that there's a different business model for this, which is the business model for employees as customer is a multi-sided business model, which is that there's two customers now. There's employees on one side, and there's the standard customer on the other, both of whom need to be satisfied in order to be successful. And so the most fundamental structure underneath this is the business model. And both sides need to be successful, which is why the existing frame is not completely wrong. It's just too dominant.
It took me 10 to 12 years to come to that place that you just got to, which is not thinking about these mindsets, these ways of thinking, these frames as like right or wrong. We can think about them as productive or unproductive in relation to particular goals. And the best way to think about them is with this idea of balance. And so a lot of the work that we do is around, the degree to which people think individualistically, like the strength of the bootstraps model in American culture, and how that, if it's out of balance, is really problematic, right? It leads people to see fixing the people rather than fixing the system as the solution. So what we're trying to do is achieve better balance between individualism and contextualism, like the idea that what surrounds us shapes us. And never would we want to move all the way to contextualism, because it turns out the decisions that people make do matter. And we can't say that understanding of the world is wrong. We can say that it's unproductive in its current imbalance. And then what we're trying to achieve is better balance between those perspectives, and that the solutions to social problems really lie at that balance point.
What I can see as an extension of what you're working on now in terms of the implementation is that there are moments of leverage where the frame needs to be there. It doesn't have to be every place. It has to be there when policy is being set. It has to be there. Well, it's an example, by the way. Parents are like the people on the ground who are actually implementing a lot of the things that need to be done. But there are moments there when a parent needs to think a particular way, and there are moments when policymakers need to think. The truth is, the frame just needs to be there then. And knowing where those leverage points are, those moments, there's got to be a better name for them. It seems like a part of the toolkit.
Yeah, I think what you just said is a big part of what I was inarticulately trying to talk about as a mobilization strategy. So a mobilization strategy isn't all the time, everywhere, forever. Like that ain't going to happen. But it's really thinking about, who needs to hear it when and how, right? There's a great communications equation from a communications scholar, Walter Lippmann, a long time ago, who said that the way to think about this stuff is who says what, to whom, through which channel, for what effect, right? And so thinking through those 5 parts of that equation are the key to a mobilization strategy, and never are the answer to those things like everyone, everything, all places, all effects, right? That's the antithesis of being strategic in how you mobilize ideas. And so I think you're right. It's trying to get the right information to figure out, like you said, who needs to hear what when to start to make some of these shifts.
There's a question I ask at the end of every episode. And I'm going to ask it, and then I'm going to tell you why I ask it, because it's related to our discussion. And the question is, what job do you hire your job to do for you? And I'll tell you why I ask it, which is it's a marketing question. And it's a question that you use to know how to design a product. That's one of the questions that you never ask when people are inputs to production, is marketing questions about the work. And so what do you hire your job to do for you?
To help drive and help us figure out this mobilization piece of things. That's the biggest kind of amplification factor that I can see of this work. I really like the idea, the kind of frame shift that you're thinking about employees as inputs to employees as consumers. I think that's really smart. And I think we could do a bunch of research to figure out like what that shift does when you present it to people. And that would be great. But that is not the answer to the problem, right? The answer to the problem is, once you have a reframe that is effective, how do you implement it? I mean, I talk about mobilization, but maybe implementation is better. Like, how do you implement that? And I love and found kind of liberating this idea that you said a while ago of we're really just we're working at the level of companies and not the level of American culture. And I think that is I think I've heard you use these words before, but that's like a really efficacious chance to experiment and try this stuff out and learn how to do it. And I'd love to kind of continue to learn from you as you start to do that, as you start to work with other people to do that, because I think that that implementation stuff on whatever scale we do it is the area of this work that needs the most kind of push and advancing. And there's a lot of smart people over the last 5 or 10 years who are thinking about it, but there's a lot of good work still left to be done there.
Yeah, and the experimental organism that they have is too big. My father was a geneticist, and he essentially was one of the big people who established fruit flies as the experimental organism. They're small, they're easy to feed, they don't take up a lot of space, they reproduce really fast, they have lots of external things you can look at to see if they've been mutated. And companies could be that for this work. Companies could be that kind of...
Companies may not appreciate that analogy, but I hear what you're saying, and I find it exciting and kind of liberating, because the hardest part of the work that I do is thinking, if I'm in the business of culture change, that is a Sisyphean task, right? That is a really overwhelming thing, not only to think about, but to think about how we actually do.
So first of all, let me see if I can go get a grant, and I'll come back and I'll hire your company. So that's one thing, because that would be a lot of fun. The second thing is the characteristics of the problem you have chosen to hire your job for. I recognize. One is it's unsolved. So it's not like you're solving it for the 10th time. You're there at the forefront of something where the discovery is original. And I think that's very attractive. And the second thing about the design, I'm talking about the design of the problem you're trying to solve as a part of your work, is that it's important that we get it right. And the third thing is, if it's not solved, a lot of other work goes to waste. A lot of other work, and a lot of your life's work goes to waste. And so there's this thing right there, this thing. I can see why that's an incredibly attractive thing to hire your job for.
I love that. I'm going to hire my job for that. I also think it's like collaborative, and there's something really like this is not a problem that's solved by one person at their desk putting their head down and working really hard hoping to pass, right? This is a problem that requires a whole bunch of people from different perspectives who are thinking about this and have different things to bring to it, which is another way of saying like it's a learning task. That's the coolest part about the work that I've gotten to do for the last 15 years. I've learned so much and not ready to stop.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
frameworksinstitute.org is where you can find our organizational website where, as a nonprofit organization, all the work that we do is free and publicly available. And we have done work on, over the years, probably upwards of 40 social issues now in the United States. And we'll be adding work and labor to that portfolio soon. So if you're interested, I imagine you are, in that particular issue, keep an eye out for that. And hopefully that is work that is helpful to all of you who are listening.
And for people who are listening, this is an incredible resource, this site. This is where I did a lot of the research to understand how I was going to talk and ask what questions I was going to ask today. It's deep. There's years and years and years of research. It's searchable, and you can find, even if it's not exactly the thing that you're after, you can find examples, analogs for what you're working on. I think it's fantastic. I really appreciated that. It was a great site. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It was great to talk with you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.